This version of the presentation has changes from the version that was presented to Group 1 based on feedback received from them. That presentation was too long and emphasized installation details. This version adds an additional demonstration to the 4 demonstrations in the previous version and skips much of the narrative with slides. An updated version of this video will be available within a couple of weeks that will contain all of the material, a few clarifications, and perhaps some additional topics. If you will be installing SSIS and DQS, you may wish to view that version to see some nuances about installation and security that you may not expect. That material can also be found elsewhere, but the video contains a convenient summary of installation issues. The next version of SQL Server, codenamed Denali, has been officially renamed SQL Server 2012. It has some great new features and enhancements to existing features to make them more usable. In SSIS 2005 and 2008, there were 2 choices for deployment: deployment of packages to the file system and deployment to MSDB. Configurations to adapt packages to their new environment upon deployment were stored in XML files and SQL Server configuration tables. These deployment models can still be used in SSIS 2012, but now an additional method of deployment is favored. Creating the new SSIS catalog in the relational database supports this new deployment model. Previously, the concept of a project was lost once a package was deployed. Projects only existed on developers' computers, where Business Intelligent Development Studio projects are created. If you use the new deployment model in SSIS 2012, a project exists not only in the Solution Explorer of BIDS, it is a unit of deployment that shares objects between packages. There are shared connection managers, shared environments that replace configurations, and a new SSIS catalog for storing the packages in a SQL Server database. Configurations stored in XML files and SQL Server tables have been replaced by parameters and SSIS DB environment configurations. SSIS provides detailed package execution reports that detail the time taken for each task and step of a data flow. The information is stored and graphically displays the change of execution duration over time. Undo Redo, Shared Connection Managers, and the Resolve Differences dialog box are a few of the enhancements that make SSIS 2012 more usable. Upgrading packages to SSIS 2012 by opening them in BIDS is very straightforward, and few tasks should be broken following the upgrade. However, the execution of DTS 2000 tasks and ActiveX tasks are no longer supported. Data Quality Services is an optional set of features and tools that allow SSIS packages to be able to use the new data cleansing transform. 2 databases are added to the SQL Server relational database for this purpose, and a data quality client is used to configure them so that their data can be used in packages. DQS components and databases must exist on the same server as SSIS 2012. The data cleansing transform exists in SSIS data flows with other transforms. Although the integration service still exists as a top-level item in Management Studio, there is an integration services node under the SQL Server Relational Engine Management tree. The SSIS DB catalog is not created by default. It must be created by right-clicking on the Integration Services folder and selecting Create Catalog. After creation of the SSIS DB catalog, the SSIS catalog will appear in 2 places. One appearance is as a SQL Server database. Although it appears in this location in the management tree, you interact with this database and the SSIS catalog functionality that it represents through the Integration Services folder that is part of the Relational Database Management tree. The interface to the actual SSIS service appears the same as it did in previous versions, managing legacy deployment locations and displaying running package information, which information is enhanced. The new SSIS node in the management tree for the SQL Server Relational Database shows up initially without anything beneath it, and you must right-click to add logical folders beneath this node to deploy projects and packages to this location. The concept of a folder in SSIS DB does not refer to a physical folder in the file system. It does not even refer to the physical hierarchy of objects in a database, but refers to the logical hierarchy that is maintained within tables that developers do not interact with directly. You cannot see the SSIS folders in SSMS by looking at the SSIS DB database. Previously, a project was a developer's local container for packages that otherwise did not have any intrinsic relationship to each other. Common configuration files and logical relationships could exist, but these were not recognized by the development environment. The concept of a project disappeared entirely when packages were deployed. As we will see shortly, this has changed. Parameters replace configurations. Parameters can exist at the package level or at the project level. Within BIDs, parameters can be marked so that they must be encrypted, and so that the values in production will not default to the values used in development if a parameter's value is missing. In previous versions of integration services, the configurations which were missing or could not be opened in production defaulted to values in development. It was too easy to believe packages were executing correctly merely because they were completing successfully, but pointing at the wrong data. A Parameters tab will appear in the Designer workspace when the new deployment model is being used in a project, and the Package Configurations menu item under the SSIS menu will not be present. If using the legacy deployment model, the menu item will be present and the tab will disappear. A package in BIDs can be converted between deployment models by selecting a context menu item in the project node of Solution Explorer within BIDs. Converting a package with XML configurations from the legacy deployment model to the new model can actually teach you how parameters are used, because BIDs removes the configurations and creates parameters automatically through this conversion. When a package is edited in Development Studio, any change to a data source or destination or change to a transform may result in a fatal mismatch between names and data types of items at various points in the pipeline. With the new Resolve References dialog box, fixing these changes and inconsistencies is much easier. There is now a Shared Connections Manager within a folder of an SSIS 2012 project if the project is using the SSIS catalog mode of deployment, which is the default. Connections created here do not appear here but appear with bold font in every package. BIDs now has Undo Redo for SSIS projects, although a few actions, such as the deletion of Shared Connection Managers within a package, cannot be undone. Here we have a project using the legacy deployment model. This is SSIS 2012, and the legacy deployment model is not the default. We'll see how to switch between the deployment models later in this demonstration. We see it has one data flow task that copies the database source table to a flat file destination. The flat file destination is associated with a connection manager, and the connection manager gets one of its values from a package level variable. It is interesting to note that if we create new variables in SSIS 2012, by default it creates them at the package level regardless of where we are in a package. Most variables are created at the package level. Previously, there was no way to change the scope of a variable without deleting the variable and recreating it. Now we do have a way of changing the scope after a variable has been created. So the destination for the flat file is determined by a package level variable. A second control flow task is to execute another package, and that package is package 1 in this same project. A file system task copies a file to a destination path, which are both variables. What we want to do is hook those up so that the destination of the first task with the data flow creating a file becomes the source path for the second package. In order to wire these up, we can come into the initial package and enable package configurations so that we can specify what the variable of the destination is through an XML configuration. We can go into package 1 and see that there are two package configurations. One is a parent package variable that points to the file path variable of the parent. Notice that we get no help in filling it in because the project doesn't know what parent can call it. It could actually be called by multiple parents. And we see that that writes to the value of the source path variable for the second package control flow task. The destination is an ordinary XML configuration file that points to the destination path variable value. If we go to the original package and execute it, we'll see that it completes successfully, copying from the default values, which in fact were the second package read the source location from the file path variable of the original package. Since we are in the legacy deployment model, we will see we have some options to create a deployment utility and specify its location. Whenever we build the project, and that will include executing, it will recreate this subdirectory that copies files to it for deployment. If we look at the subdirectory, into the project, into the bin folder, we'll see that there is a deployment folder which contains files we recognize, the two DTSX files, two configuration files, and a file with the extension SSIS deployment manifest. We take these files and put them on a network share or some place accessible to our target environment. We click on Deployment Manifest and we see a welcome to this wizard. Please notice that the name of the wizard includes package in it. Although there's nothing else on the screen to tell us, that means we are using the legacy method of deployment. The new method of deployment is not deploying packages, it's deploying projects. So that's one way we can tell how we are deploying. We can do a file system deployment or a SQL Server deployment. Let's do a file system deployment. And notice that it tells where it will be installing it by default. It puts it in a location under Program Files in a subdirectory, and then it begins deployment. Notice it lets us pick one of the DTS config files that contains the XML properties that can be changed through this method. And we can select the property or properties that we wish to change, and we can specify a new value. When we go look at the destination location, we will see that it has copied the packages and the XML configuration files. Please notice that it has taken our changes and incorporated them within the values that have been changed. That isn't quite what I meant to do, so I can still fix it here. But more importantly, notice that it has gone into the package and changed the path of the DTS config file to its new location in the file system to where the package is deployed. If someone had just copied the file to the new location, the hard-coded path to the old location would still be in the file. And even if the package could not find the configuration file at runtime, it would default to the values contained in the package. It would not fail. So it would either find the wrong file if it could still access the original location, or it would use the wrong values. One way to address this problem was by configuring jobs appropriately when creating them to be run by SQL Server agent. Notice we can create a job that contains a step to run an integration services package. We can configure it so that the package will fail on validation warning. It attempts to validate that the XML configuration files exist, but that only generates a warning. That does not cause the package to fail unless this box is checked. I recommend that this box always be checked when using XML configuration files. Under the new deployment model, we can also specify that values must be provided at runtime that are different than those that were used at design time. Enabling both of these features is an extra measure to assure that you are not misled by a package succeeding in execution but pointing to the wrong data. Now, let's convert the package to the new deployment model. This is the same context menu that is used to switch from the new deployment model to the legacy deployment model. We get a wizard, and it comes and asks which packages in the project we wish to migrate to the new deployment model. Notice that it is going to migrate these items and a project object, which is new because there wasn't a project object to deploy previously. Notice that it is finding we have a package with a parent, and we can see we can change which package is to be executed at this point. Notice that we can change which configurations we wish to change. Notice that it displays the configurations we have previously identified. The original package had an XML configuration file with a configuration string that pointed to the location of the configuration file. There was a parent variable for the package 1, and the configuration file also contained a pointer to the configuration file. These are the items that are going to be migrated. Notice it will also remove the configuration file from the packages after migration. So we will select all of the packages and all the configurations associated with it. We will then go ahead and identify each of the properties that we wish to migrate. The name, these are variables in this case, can change their scope here if we wish to project level variable to localize all of our properties and variables to one location. They are now associated with the project. We can specify whether values must be supplied that are different than the original default values. We can change those values at these points, and we can specify whether they should be encrypted. We now see that the packages have been migrated and project object recognized as containing project level items. We come back, notice that instead of having data sources here, we have project parameters, which now shows the items we have brought up to the project level, and it shows the packages. If we build this, we will also notice that building the project has created a file with an ISPack extension. We can send that to a new location, or we can double-click on it here, which will launch the Integration Services Deployment Wizard. Notice that it says nothing about package in its title. That's why we know that it is for the new deployment model. The other wizard had the word package in it. Now we can double-click on it and deploy it, or since we're still in Visual Studio, we can come and right-click and say deploy, in which event we get exactly the same wizard. The first thing that it asks is for the source, which is the ISPack file. We can also deploy using this wizard if there is a package in an Integration Services catalog that we wish to deploy someplace else. It validates and asks the name of the server that we wish to deploy to. Then it shows us the folder structure of the Integration Services catalog. We select the location and deploy. Next, let's go to Management Studio, where the project has been deployed. We have a project with 2 packages. Notice that we can configure the project. We can come in and pick individual packages if they have their own local parameters. We can also specify in the project that there are certain parameters to supply for the entry point and that other parameters are handled internally and are not necessary. If we come and specify a parameter, we can enter a value here and change that, and that will be saved. A more interesting feature is that we can come and create environments. The environment is a collection of variables that we have created on the physical or virtual server, which we can give a name, and after we create it and open its properties, there are more values that we can see, and there is a variables page, and this means environment variables. So these are environment variables that we must create at the operating system level. They may or may not have the same name parameters. Just for the sake of the distinction, let's call it environment file path. And we can highly type these because environment variables are all strings. And we can give it an initial value. By creating the environment variables and providing values here, we have not actually created the environment variables in the operating system, but we have provided default values for them if they are not found. We can also assign permissions for the environment so that it may not be used by just anybody. Once we have created an environment that contains references to environment variables, we can come into a project or to individual packages. Returning to the project or package configuration menu item and dialog, we can go to the references page and assign an environment or environments to project or the package. Once we do, we can return to the parameters page and see that the use environment variable option is now enabled. And when we do that, we can select an environment variable from the environment that we have created and say that instead of providing a value, we are providing the name of an environment variable which will be examined at execution time and used. Notice that when the value is not really a value but points to an environment variable, the name of the environment variable is underlined. If it isn't underlined, then the actual value can be provided and is used. Now, if we go and run our base package, it tells us that the destination path was not found. And that was because we have to create the destination path, and if we are in Visual Studio, we must also restart Visual Studio so that the environment variables will be read. So we can go ahead at this point and we can provide the value that we wish to be used for the execution. There are a few other issues that I'd like to address because they're emphasized in presentations that I have seen by others. Business Intelligence Development Studio 2012 is now hosted in Visual Studio 2010, although it has the appearance of Visual Studio 2010. Some of the components have been custom written for performance, such as the display of the SSIS toolbox. The data viewer can now be enabled with a single click. It is possible to group items in the data flow by selecting them and right-clicking and selecting the Group Context Menu item. This permits us to give a subset of transforms a particular name and to move them around as a group if we please. This grouping has no property and is entirely for our convenience. There is also a new control flow task, the Expression tab, which permits us to put any expression in it that we please. This is a separate place for finding expressions, and it is never evaluated until runtime, so it cannot result in a validation error. Because we emphasize the deployment model so much, it will be easy to confuse deployment model with the feature set available. However, they are completely separate issues. This is the data quality client, and it contains several pieces that are tied together so that you can jump between them, start out in one place and wind up in another. We're going to create a new knowledge base, and we're going to give it a name of police data. We're going to come over and jump right into knowledge discovery, and we're going to look at some data that we have collected. Let the tool do some guesses about things that are correct and incorrect with no previous information supplied. We're going to map columns in this table to a domain, which is a definition of what values it contains. Since we don't have one that exists, we're going to create one called incident category, and we specify a data type for it. Associated with this, we can also go ahead and specify that when it is output, what kind of format we wish it to have. So this is just a string. There isn't much more to say at this time, although we can add some qualifications later. We'll go down and pick street also, and we'll have a domain that is called street name. It will also be a string. We're then going to go to the next screen and have it start its automatic analysis of the data. Now, we have provided no information about this. It is still going to go out and figure out what might be mistakes and make suggestions, but we're going to have an opportunity to correct it. Notice here it lists all the individual values, tells us how many there are under our two domains. And if we click and say, just show me the errors, we'll see that it has suggested some changes to street names that it really knew nothing else about. It suspects that Howdershell is misspelled in one case to be Howershell. That is correct. That Missouri Bottom is misspelled in one case. That is correct. And that Hanley is misspelled. All of these are correct. I do not believe it is correct in saying that South Florissant should be changed to North Florissant, because both of those exist. Once we change that, it takes it out of the list. Notice that it did not find any invalid values. It's going to find invalid values when we put some constraints on the domains that appear like check constraints in the database, and we haven't done that yet. If we look at incident categories, we can look and see that it has found some things that are even meaningless words, but it is suggesting that some of them are associated with each other. Now I'm going to go in and change an abbreviation for burglary to burglary, and let's see what it does in the user interface after we do. It goes ahead and shows them as a hierarchy and will group similar things together. We have the ability to edit all sorts of things. Now if we come in here and look at the errors, we see it's going to show us the ones it found as well as the ones that I made. There are no invalid entries because we haven't placed any constraints on the domain yet. Now we'll go ahead and publish it, which means put it back in our database that is our knowledge base. Let's come in and look at police data and edit the domains. Here we're going to give it information that to me resembles constraints that we would put on a database. This is not something that it might be able to figure out by looking at the data. So we're going to have some domain rules, and one of the rules we're going to have is about the length of the field. Although we won't use it in this case, this can have multiple issues involved, and they can be nested with ands and ors as though there were parentheses in there. But we're just going to keep ours simple and say that the length has to be limited. Now it turns out if we have a constraint that is going to affect the validity of existing data, it goes ahead and tells us. So we can go ahead and see what effect our constraint is going to have on existing rules that it already has. So we're going to go ahead and make one where it doesn't affect our existing data, but we could have done it. And it would have turned certain entries that were valid before into entries that are invalid now. We have the ability to hook up to web services that provide information about address checking and other items. We can also come in and see the values and edit them, that they were done in our knowledge discovery. Next, we'll go in to see that we can have a matching policy, because these domains are not necessarily the names of database columns, and they may match up to many different columns in different databases. So we'll have one domain that is going to map to different column names, potentially in different tables, perhaps in different databases. Here we can go ahead and map it. Now I did that before for the purpose of the knowledge discovery, but now I'm doing it and it becomes part of the metadata of the table. We can create more sophisticated rules which are beyond the scope of the demonstration here. We can come in and set some limits for the fuzzy matching that was done that it used in correcting my data. And we can also go in and see a log of who has interacted with what knowledge base and with what data through using this tool to see how it has been used and how it's logged. We can also go back and see the results of analysis that it did when it did the knowledge discovery. In this demonstration, we are going to see a simple use of the data cleansing transformation. We're going to create a data flow task that has a data source that is a copy of the table that we used to build our knowledge base. We're going to create a connection manager that points to the table and supply its name, which is new incidents. Now we haven't told anything to the knowledge base about this table. We told it about the other table. We see it has some data in it. We're then going to add a data cleansing transformation. And connect it to the data source. We then create a connection to the knowledge base, or the DQS databases, and provide the name of the knowledge base we're going to use. We then have to tell it what columns we want to cleanse and how they map. Although this is the same table, it is under a different name, so DQS doesn't know anything about it until we tell it. Notice it's going to add two columns to tell whether there was a corrected version, what the status of the field is. We're also going to ask it to give us columns about the confidence that it used in its fuzzy figuring of things out and the reason that it classified something in a certain way. You can use these or not, but they're provided so that you can interpret the output how you wish. We're now going to output this to a flat file. And click the mapping page as we always must. When we run the transformation, we see it completes, and we will look at the file that is output. When we open it, we'll see that there are columns saying that things were correct or not. There is also a column that tells the status of the record if there are multiple ways that the record can be corrected or can fail. Now we'll put a conditional split in and show a brief sample of what we might do. We can come in and say that we want things that have been corrected to go to a different location for our examination, or perhaps other processing feedback we wish to give back to the data source people. And then we'll send the rest of the stuff to correct. Now, there are actually more statuses that there could be, so that is not a correct handling of the data. We'll send one output to one location and the other output to the other. We'll run the package, and we'll look at the file that contains the corrected records. In SSIS 2012, Management Studio has many new reporting features that will assist in understanding the SSIS environment in production. If we right-click on the SSIS DB node under Integration Services, we'll see that there is a screen for active operations that will give information about currently running packages. If we go to the node associated with a project or a package, if we right-click on Reports, we'll see that there are some standard reports included. The Integration Services dashboard can be used to access the others that you saw at this level. It will tell us about what packages have succeeded and failed, give some information where we can drill down into those that, for example, have succeeded, and we can drill down further into them. Since these are all for the same package, I'm going to approach it a different way. Notice here that we can come in and filter this by various criteria when we wind up with a large number of executions. If I right-click on the project or package, we can come in and look at standard reports. And let's look at all executions for an example of what we might see. Each execution gets a different number. So these were 3, 4, and 5. It succeeded all 3 times. It tells us about the package, start time, and end time. Let's look at the overview. We'll see that it shows information about the package, its status again, and then below, for this particular execution of the package, it will tell about each task and information further about it. When we drill down further into a data flow task, we are going to see each transformation that occurred. Information about what order it occurred, what component executed, and information telling about the parameters that were used in it, as well as how many rows were generated. We'll see that it has a very important part here. Parameters used. Some of these are system parameters, but parameters that were used in the project can be seen. Very often, values that were used here could not be easily seen, and dumps had to be taken to get some of this information. We can also view performance of the package, where it will show recent executions graphically comparing their execution time, as well as who called it. This is a brief demonstration showing the powerful new reporting features in SSIS 2012 using the SSIS catalog deployment model. Remember that Premier offers a workshop taught by PFEs covering SQL Server Integration Services 2005 and 2008. Virtually all of the information contained in it is applicable to SQL Server 2012, and I expect that the course will be upgraded. Richard Thorpe has prepared a chalk talk on integration services that he is making available for use by others, and I'm sure he would be pleased to present it himself upon request.